Hello and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week, we dive into the stories, technology, and ideas shaping a sustainable and profitable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the AgCulture Podcast, and today we are doing an in-person interview with a gentleman named Steve Sweet. Now, I've known Steve for several years now, back in his role that he had working for a dairy equipment manufacturer and technology manufacturer in the dairy industry. Steve has gone all around North America working with a dealer network for the manufacturing company that he worked for. And now he's at a local dealer level. And I thought this would be an interesting episode just to get a perspective. A lot of farmers and those that work in agriculture don't necessarily get to see the perspective of the people servicing the farms. So I thought this would be an interesting episode to see how that's changed over time and some of Steve's thoughts being on both the local side and national and international perspective as well, seeing across the spectrum of that. So I think there's a nugget out of this interview that anyone, whether you're a farmer, a dealer yourself, a manufacturer rep, or an ag technology company that's trying to figure out where to go in the market and how to market to farmers, I think there's a nugget for everybody here listening to this episode. So please enjoy this episode with Steve Sweet. Well, today in my wonderful studio here in my barn at Dream Winds Dairy, I have the pleasure of having Steve Sweet, who I've known for quite a number of years now. And we're going to talk about a topic that I haven't really hit on, but I think would be an interesting perspective. So on this podcast, we talk a lot about things pertaining to farmers. And this one does pertain to farmers, but it's looking at it from a different perspective. We're going to be looking at manufacturer dealership relationships and farmer-dealer relationships. This one in particular to the dairy equipment world, but I think a lot of the conversation that we're going to have can really pertain to a lot of the manufacturer to dealer to farmer relationships as well. So welcome, Steve, to the podcast. Thanks for being here. If you want to start out giving a little bit of background of your agricultural history and your career, that'd be great.
I guess my background, I was raised on a dairy in central Michigan. Adopted into it as a baby, so this is all I've known. College was even an interesting time. Started at Michigan State, wound up transferring, going to Cal Poly. So everyone asked, why would you leave MSU to go west? It was kind of simple. I wanted to go where the cows were. Obviously, we know a lot about universities and what you want to learn and the legacy of them, but nothing beats the ideology of going where big ag lives and learning and seeing what that was. Came home, worked in the nutrition sector for quite a while, doing consulting, whether for big companies or as a private, and really always liked the consulting side. And that's how I wound up getting into more of the dairy automation side of things. They needed a lot of consulting, a lot of advising, how to get farms to implement, and did that. And I had the opportunity to kind of come full circle and come back home and work more localized. And still farm at home with the family too.
Yep. So I think one important aspect that I really want to start out with is there was kind of a metamorphosis of mindset, probably about the time that you kind of came on board with the dairy equipment manufacturer as a rep, going out to the dealer network that they were setting up at that time, and now have well established across all of North America. So you've seen things from a lot of different geographies over a good amount of time. What was the mindset change or the key shifts in the business models for the dealers as they were more used to putting in physical hardware, physical parlors, selling consumable items that you could touch and feel, and then transforming into more technology businesses?
Yeah, I think you think about the evolution. We went from bearings and grease zerks to wire cabling, and more or less the output changed. So the output was always, in the dairy equipment world was milk. Simple concept. Milk in the tank from the pipeline.
Yep.
Well, now we're also harvesting data. And a lot of farms are, what do I do with this data? What does it mean? Does it mean anything? Everyone talked about the value of data, but nobody knew how to interpret it. Mm-hmm. And what is the animal actually telling us? So that's where the role and the evolution started with, the farm would present the questions to the dealer, and the dealer might not be sure, so the questions would come to the manufacturer. Sometimes the manufacturer doesn't even know all the answers either. So it's that relationship that really had to start, and what does everything really mean to it, and what are the farm's goals in the end?
So. From a staffing standpoint in those businesses, I mean, you worked quite closely with several people at each one of the dealers that you worked with. Mm-hmm. What did that mentality and maybe even roles look like that had to change in those businesses?
I think the role change occurred when, early adoption was, how do I, when you think about automated milking in particular, how do I even start? And that's where working with the personnel at dealerships, going through the startup process, getting farms on board. And then it got to the point where, startups aren't too bad. We know we have a program, we have a process that we go through, but then it came 6 to 9 months later, a year later. Well, now what? Yeah, like I want to get better production. I want to improve efficiencies, whatever it might be. So we're spending more time educating those individuals at the dealer, trying to help the farm in the long run.
Yep. So it
became an educational piece.
Right. And on the technician side of things, what did that look like? Most of the people probably at a lot of these dealers were more sales focused originally. Mm-hmm. Whether that be selling teat dip or selling a parlor. What type of support did the dealers really have to build out to service technology? How is that different than what they were used to?
I think it's understanding. Huge piece of it's always the computer side of it, the networking of it. How did the systems talk to each other? What's a cloud? That was
it's not just in the sky, right?
Correct. What does that mean? Where does it go? How's it stored? I remember a time spamware started, and it started infiltrating farms, and it was like, how do we get rid of this? Like, it's not something that can be fixed with a screwdriver.
Yeah.
So, there's an educational learning curve, learning path had to be created for that as well.
So over your career, the dealer networks, especially in dairy, just like the farms, as farms went away, the dealer networks consolidated. What had you seen in your career that's really driven that, and what were the dealers that actually survived and thrived in that consolidation?
I think being open-minded, the willingness to adapt, I should say. Understanding the technology, wanting to go from just selling a machine or selling a whole good and walking away saying thanks, and we'll
see you in 20 years.
See you when you want the next one, or maybe if there's an issue, we'll be out. And now we're seeing the evolution of, I use scheduled maintenance, for example. Let us handle it for you. Let's fix some prices. When we're coming, and take the volatility out. Remove as much as we can. Supporting from a consulting side. How do we keep your business running smoothly? Data management, data analytics, understanding, the idea of milking a cow has evolved so much. We're still mm-hmm. harvesting milk,
right,
but looking at right down quarter by quarter to the second, and clean, comfortable, and all of those things. So,
yep. So the dealers that survived, is that also based on geography? Has that had a lot to do with it? What are some of the other geography differences that you've seen across the vast area that you've traveled through?
As farms consolidate, we've seen dealers consolidate. We look at travel times. How far can you get there? If something was to happen in the middle of the night, that relationship between the dealer and the farm, does that dealer feel good about, can I get to that farm on time and service them to the best of my ability? So we've seen some of that. And if you look across the geographical regions, that's where we start to see a little bit bigger dealership network, where farms are getting bigger or growing, or the populace is still concentrated.
Yeah. Has the relationship between the manufacturer and the dealer changed quite a bit over your career?
I wouldn't say it's changed. I'd say it's always the same arguments. I mean, we could talk for hours on that part, but it's always the who's to blame, or can you come out here and do this, or it gets sticky at times. And ultimately, sometimes the farm just says, I want the manufacturer out here. I want to talk to the manufacturer. I want their opinion. And being in a dealer's shoes, I don't know, is that throwing shade on me or as a dealer? And then as a manufacturer, the question of, well, is this dealer doing what they're supposed to be doing? Mm-hmm. And it just creates, we do as much as we can to keep the animosity out of it. It needs to be a strong line of communication, top to bottom, of what's going on, what are the needs, what are the feelings, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so.
Do you think the relationship, maybe on the training side, or the involvement of the manufacturers as things got more technical, has changed?
I think so. In the early days, it was train frequent, train often, and in person. And really where I saw a big shift was during COVID, because we couldn't get together. We couldn't have people gather together and go through things. So working a lot remotely. So now there are many opportunities for a dealership, especially the good manufacturers are having monthly touch points. Let's have these monthly calls. What are you seeing? What did you learn on your own? And really trying to start to dial things in and build that book of knowledge.
Yep.
If we see this, we should do that, and create those step by steps. Because like you mentioned earlier about staffing, as dealers are having to hire, or even the manufacturers are having to hire, where the playbooks are already in place to be used to teach.
Yep.
So.
Now the other thing that I find really interesting is you look at both in the dairy equipment world, where you have predominant milk harvesting manufacturer, like they've focused on milk harvesting for maybe 100 years. They're now building things for feeding systems and manure handling systems and these sorts of things. And you look at John Deere and the similar aspect and some of the things that they're getting into, and the GPS systems that they're getting into, not necessarily their core business. How has that shaped how a dealer has to respond? Somebody that's always thinking, I'm just here to help with milk harvest. Now I've got to think about nutrition, and basically look at it more as a whole farm system rather than a specific solution.
You very well might run into a dealer that's just not willing to touch that product line or that piece of the business, and not willing to address it quite yet, because they feel like they can't either support it yet, or it's just too much unknown. And so that's where, supply and demand, push and pull. What do the farms want? And so on and so forth. So we have seen that. And I've seen that in my career. And it's always interesting where you might have a farm that wants something that a dealer could get, the manufacturer's ready, but then it's an all hands on deck training. I don't like to say hand holding, but being a good business partner, top to bottom, and working through it and learn as we go, if you will.
Yeah.
So one thing I did want to bring up, Paul, you mentioned staffing.
Yeah.
And that's always been, I wouldn't say a sore spot, but it can be a testy spot between manufacturer to dealer to farm. And it's a really weird cycle. Then you can throw in new college graduates or people wanting to enter the industry. And I look back at myself, human nature says the higher up the food chain you go, the better you're going to be. And, when you work for a manufacturer level and you're working with dealers, and you run into people where, I'd love to work for the manufacturer. And as a manufacturer, it's almost like, they're really good, and we need that here, and we can use that to, in essence, spread the gospel, somebody solid like that. But then in the long run, you might have a very bitter dealer of, Why'd you take one of my best employees?
Right.
So on and so forth. But when you're at the manufacturer, you meet some guys that are like, I really miss just being on the farms, or miss being local. And I can say that for myself. And to step down and go to the dealer level, people are like, isn't that the world's worst move? And I go, not in my mind. That was an opportunity that was offered and a chance that I wanted to take and get closer to the farms. Now, what's interesting is you add academia to it, or new college grads or new entrants. And for my roles working at the manufacturer and sitting through interviewees of, boy, here's a guy might not have the degree hanging on the wall, but I know he'd be rock solid teaching other at the dealer level. He'd instantly bond on the farm. I'm not going to let that never was a deciding factor for me, what was hanging on the wall behind him. Now, what interesting is you interview a college grad, and depending what sort of recommendations, a little bit of who are you, how do you think they would do? So there's always a nervousness to that. Well, maybe you need to start at the dealer level, and we always joke, cut your teeth and get alligator skin. So it's a unique dynamic, still ongoing, and probably will go on for a long time, of putting people in the right places and where do you find the best people at.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, for outside of the dairy equipment world, I think a lot of this pertains to other ag tech companies that are coming out. Maybe it's a startup that's just getting commercialized. What should they look at to decide if they should pursue a dealer network versus going it alone on their own as a manufacturer?
It's business 101. Do you want the whole pie that's really small, or do you want a piece of a big pie? I mean, that's up to every entrepreneur's ideology, what is ideal. My hat's always off for the entrepreneurs, because everywhere somebody had to start. Whether you're a large tractor manufacturer or milking equipment, it started somewhere in somebody's workshop or somebody's back room office.
Especially in agriculture,
in
right?
Ag, it's a doodle. And there's probably going to be a lot of failure along the way. And, proof of concept, test the concept. Those are always the biggest things. Even the big manufacturers, the proof of concept, taking it out in the field, validating it, and having a thorough validation is key to that. But like we've been talking about dealership network, it's working with those really rock solid dealers that can go to the farm and present an idea or a concept that this requires some validation. We need some data. Mm-hmm. Or is this a true partnership between the farm, the dealer, and the manufacturer? And can we keep everybody out while we're studying this thing to see what it really means?
Right.
So, yeah, it's. I think dealers are crucial to all this, because they're the nearest boots on the ground to all of this. So
yeah, especially as things get more technical, it seems like, at least for me with the technology that I have here, I would not be able to operate it without a good dealer and having a good relationship with my dealer. Yeah. So with that, what are some of the specific things that you think a newer company bringing that technology to the market should really focus on if they decide, yeah, we're going to build a dealer network? I know, the company that you worked for was kind of, as that time you were coming on, they were still building up a dealer network. And what did that look like?
The ability, they always love the ability to sell. Do you have those? But I would even go a level higher. Does a dealer have a relationship with farms? And is it a sound relationship? Not just from the ability to sell, but the ability to support.
Yeah.
Are they the first call that farm's going to think of? Like, whether or not they carry the brand or whatnot, I wonder if they would be able to figure out how to fix this. Is that dealer intuitive and have that relationship with a farm owner? I think that is so crucial to have, and probably a key importance of that, because whether it's, especially with new technology, there could be bumps and bruises along the way.
Yep. And
is that relationship strong enough to weather some of those testy moments? And in my role, I've walked into some of those farm offices where it can be very testy. But at the end of the day, everybody can sit down, have coffee with each other, and come up with a game plan. and what are the measurables we're going to look at the end to say this worked or it didn't work, and we need to go back and address it again.
Right. So, what advice or thoughts do you have for farmers as they work with their dealers, or how they should really vet what companies to work with in a dealer network?
Do they mean what they say, and do they do what they say? And do they, a dealer of their word? In my role right now, working with farms again, look, you ask me for something, I agree to a date, I'm going to have it by that date. And I think it's just simple human relationship. That's the key part for these dealers out there right now, and just face-to-face communicating, and don't take anything for granted, because for every elder statesman out there or behemoth of a dealer, there's somebody who's young and hungry that would give the shirt off their back to have an opportunity to get in the front door and build a relationship. And I think we can't take anything for granted in this industry, especially with all the consolidation going on. And also seeing the younger generations now return to the farm where everything is at their fingertips. Social media can train wreck a business, a product, a person, almost overnight.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. What in some of those instances, what have you seen that maybe in your roles you had to walk back that you saw on social media, or examples that really hindered that business?
I think whenever you see something on social media, somebody has a complaint, and then you sit back if you're like for me at the manufacturer level, okay, I know where this farm's located. I know who that dealer is. What is the real story? And I think from a manufacturer standpoint, we cannot be quick to judge. You have to have all the stories, because, some of you, the bad things. Well, they didn't service, fill in the blank. Well, you talk to the dealer, well, farm also, maybe we're having some financial trouble.
Hasn't paid their bill in 6 months.
Hasn't paid their bill. So it happens. Yeah. So it's always the truth. The truth is somewhere in the middle.
Right.
And you have to be patient enough and be willing to ask some of those hard questions at times. But it's still the product being represented, so you have to do your due diligence to find out. You can't just hope it all goes away.
Yeah.
Because that's the problem with social media. It leaves the fingerprint everywhere.
Right. Yeah. So, it's always going to be there after it's posted. And
correct. And I think of an example, Paul. I was at a farm, just installed some equipment, and brought up an issue they heard about. And it caught me off guard because it hadn't been an issue for years. And it was just some social media post that the farmer's son had found and brought it to his dad's attention. And so he wanted to ask. And it was nothing accusatory, but it was just have a willingness to have a discussion around it.
Yeah. You were in Canada quite a bit as well, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about the differences between Canada and the U.S. and
I think I can. Okay. I think you asked what's the difference between like U.S. and Canada, because in my role, I oversaw all of North America with a team.
Yep.
So I had Canadians, and Canada is no different than this in the U.S. because how somebody dairies in Michigan versus New York or California is just like they have that in Canada. A BC dairyman is going to be completely different than Southwest Ontario, and if you're in Southwest Ontario, they're going to be completely different than Quebec.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. And in my role, I got to see how dealers worked even in Europe and in other countries. And that was even a different angle to it. And sometimes from the manufacturer's perspective, you see all that inconsistency across the board. And you'd ask yourself, which way are we rowing? And what are we rowing towards? Who are we fighting? And the joke we had was like, well, we're all fighting the same common enemy. Well, who's the enemy? But it's still that relationship bond. In Canada, you do see smaller farms, but they do have big farms too. And I think that's a misconception that, dairymen in the States might have is everybody milks 50 cows in tie stalls in Canada. Well, I've been in 2,000 cow dairies in Canada that run just like a dairy in Tulare.
Right.
And it's still the strength of that dealer network. Now, what's interesting with some dealers, can't across North America is when you're in a geographical area where it's notoriously smaller farms, and then somebody has a major expansion, and maybe they go to 1,500, 2,500 cows, and the dealer almost is panicking over it, like they're
afraid of it,
uncomfortable, and you can see that in Canada too sometimes. But from a manufacturer side of it, they're still the same owner operator that they've always dealt with or had a relationship with. They still want to milk their cows. They still have a business to run. Conceptually, it's all the same. And that's the same thing I would tell candidates that were interviewing for jobs. Like I would ask, are you comfortable with larger operations? Everyone's going to say yes until you get them out there and the saying of, does the dog hunt?
Right.
Because those guys they're just another human being.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe a little more louder, maybe a little more brasher, but still the same. Because I can find that on a small 50 cow dairy as well too.
Right.
So,
yeah, that's personalities can be big or small, whether the operation is big or small.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things from Europe, and this is just my own opinion, but in Europe you didn't see as much consulting that we find in North America.
What do you think that is?
You buy feed from your local feed mill, and the feed mill provides the feed, and the services are all included, and so on and so forth. You see that in the feed world in Europe. You see that in the dairy equipment world, where you might have some farm management consulting from the dealer level. A little more hands off. And here it's, how do I get better? How do I be better? What's the problem? Who is my trusted advisor to all of this? And you don't necessarily see that in Europe, which I found rather fascinating.
Do you think that's kind of carryover from the old quota days, that they just weren't driven as much at that point to really progress like we were in the U.S., because it was either that or go out of business?
Yeah, I think that probably has something to do with it. Now they can say in Europe they don't have quota anymore, per se.
For a decade now, I think, almost, yeah.
But when you really start peeling that onion back, they still have an environmental quota. It's just not a production quota-based quota anymore. And I remember asking a farm one day, if you could ship the same amount of milk on fewer cows, would you? And he said, nobody's ever asked me that. I guess I've never really even thought about that. And he says, maybe. But then he also followed up with, well, I don't know if my bank would allow me to do that. So it's always asking the different questions. Of course, somebody from the States is going to have a different purview in Europe. But when I was with the manufacturer and we'd have the Europeans come over here, and they're just googly-eyed on seeing these barns, and there's 500 cows in a pen, and they just get really, I don't even know where to even start on this. So that's always a challenge too, especially with a global manufacturer.
Right. And I think that point that you brought up about which direction are we rowing, most, especially in the dairy world, most equipment manufacturers are global because they have to be, because it's a small market. Mm-hmm. So how do they really decide which direction to row if it's very different in Europe as the U.S., if both markets are important to them?
I think it's understanding that market segment. You have to, to me, you have to treat it at its own segment.
Almost like its own business.
It's its own business. And just like any major manufacturer, you can see, they have a European segment, an Asian segment, Latin America. I mean, everyone's just a little bit different, and you have to appreciate that, but you can still learn from each other's segments on how to do business and why are they successful. Because the migration is going to happen at some point, whether U.S. style farming winds up in Europe, maybe over time. I don't have a crystal ball on that. But what was fascinating is you would see that in the Asian market. Mm-hmm. You would see a little more pull of, we want to farm like the U.S.
Right.
And even parts of Canada would kind of, what's going down on the States? But then on the flip side, I'd run into producers here in the States they love the way they farm in Southwest Ontario, because that's how they grew up. I wish we could go back to that. pretty cows, pretty barns, and just good, solid animals to look at. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think we have to learn from each other on this.
Yeah.
I would say that happens with the dealers too.
What's that?
Dealers learn from other dealers.
Yeah, so it's not just farmers learning from farmers or manufacturers learning from different areas. It's the dealers learning from dealers. Do you feel like there's a good, that's one of the strengths of a good dealer network is the ability to network with the other?
Oh, absolutely. On the manufacturer side, those opportunities to get, maybe it was dealer owners all together across North America in the same room and do some presentations and just give them time to socialize and fraternize with each other. And if you ask the dealer, I want to talk to that person. I'm going to call him, or maybe I'm going to fly over and I'm going to sit down and meet with him, because dealers always learn from dealers. And just like the technicians of every dealer talk to other technicians of a dealer, and the farm consultants do the same thing as well. And we know there's these roundtable groups, again, going back to social media, these small messaging groups and whatnot. Hey, I saw this. Anyone ever seen this before? Got a quick idea? They almost get answers faster from each other at the dealer level than they ever could from the manufacturer.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Which, on the manufacturer side, it makes them really mad, or can make them mad. But, time is of the essence.
Yeah.
I don't know how many patient farmers you've ever met, but
I'm probably not one of them.
I have yet to find one. But no, everybody learns from everybody.
Yeah.
So
and I think that's a great point for any manufacturer or ag tech company that's looking at expanding or building out a dealer network, is really making that a core part of how they work with their dealers, is to make sure that they can interact together to learn from each other.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing I go back to is communication, and it's that feedback system, whether it's the farm feeding back to the dealer. Maybe the farm has the opportunity to feed back direct to manufacturer, because where I came from, the manufacturer would want to go out on farm. Now, the kink in all this is, what does the manufacturer do with the information, and do they follow up? Because it is a slow-moving giant.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're an entrepreneurial, maybe you have a startup or a new idea, you can move faster. But I would say beware, as the business grows, is your response time the same way? And that's where the importance comes in of a dealer.
Yeah.
Having that dealer as a partner where they're the extension of your business.
Yep. Well, that's a very good point. Is there anything else that we should hit on before we wrap up here on your perspective of dealer networks and dealer relationships with manufacturer and farmers?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of it. I'm sure I missed something, and I'm sure I probably miffed a couple people that will listen, but it's just my opinion and just some of the things I've saw, because ultimately everybody wants the farm to win, because without farmers, all this is for naught.
Right.
So the farms have to win in this.
Without the farmer being successful, the dealer's not going to be successful long term. The manufacturers aren't going to be successful if they don't have successful dealers.
Correct.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you being here today, Steve, talking about this topic. Very interesting one. Kind of near and dear to my heart as well, because my dad owned a farm equipment dealership, and I grew up around, seeing the manufacturer reps come in and talk to him, and how that relationship worked back then, where it was more physical based. And now today, with the transformation of more focusing on technology as well, I think it's an interesting story to talk about.
Yeah, and there's probably plenty more to come, and this chapter isn't done. The book isn't done being wrote, so it'll be interesting where it evolves from here. Yeah.
Thanks for being here today, Steve.
Yep, thanks, Paul.
Well, thanks again for listening to another episode of the AgCulture Podcast and this interview with Steve Sweet. I hope you enjoyed that and got something out of it and got a new or different perspective than what I might have hosted on the podcast in the past, or you might have heard on other podcasts. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with somebody you know. That's how we grow our audience here at the AgCulture Podcast. As always, we would love it if you could leave us a rating and review on the platform you're listening to this on. And please tune in next week for another exciting episode of the AgCulture Podcast. I'm Paul Windemuller, and thanks for listening.